Mr. Moore was a regular at the diner. He came every Sunday morning without fail, the minute we opened our doors. He liked his coffee black, his toast unbuttered, and his eggs over easy. Though he was a man of few words, Mr. Moore was a gentle and polite man. Moreover, he was a very generous tipper. And that's all that anyone at the diner really knew about him. A pleasant, albeit reserved man, one who found comfort in his routine. One Sunday, I noticed that the corner booth we'd always save for Mr. Moore remained vacant well into lunchtime. I recall glancing over every now and then, vaguely disappointed at his absence. He never showed up that day, nor did he show up on the next Sunday or the one after that. Nobody knew why he stopped coming to the diner, and nobody had any idea who to even ask. No one really knew who he was or from whence he came. As time went on, Mr. Moore became a dimmed memory, relegated to the back of our minds. The hostess no longer saved that table on Sunday mornings. The new cooks no longer knew the Moore special, and I no longer had that $100 tip to look forward to. Life went on at Eddie's diner. But one evening, a man who introduced himself as Samuel Pearson, the executor of Henry Moore's will, and once again we remembered our elderly patron. Tragic though it may be, no one was entirely surprised to learn that Mr. Moore had passed away. What did come as a surprise was that someone from the diner was named in his will as a beneficiary. What do you mean, I'm on his will? Mr. Moore did not marry or have children. In the absence of family, he named you, Rebecca Bennett, as the main beneficiary of his will. Mr. Pearson and I sat down at that familiar corner table as he patiently went over the legal documents with me. I glanced over the 2-page catalogue of assets, among them a mansion situated on 9 acres of land, some 30 miles west from our little town. I sat there in wide astonishment, my eyes agape in sheer belief. One by one my co-workers congratulated me, nearly suffocating me with their embraces. Only Pamela, the restaurant manager, shot me a dirty glare and told everyone back to work. Don't get your hopes up, honey. It's probably a haunted house or something. It would be the last time I'd ever have to hear from that vile woman. And though I knew well that Pamela was merely being petty, I couldn't rid my mind of a slur. Before he left, Mr. Pearson wrote his number down and urged me to get in touch with him as soon as I wished to proceed with the affairs of the estate. That very night, I broke the news to my family that I'd quit my job at the diner. You what? My mother was swift to lose her temper and lashed out at me like she'd always do. My stepfather merely kept his arms crossed disapprovingly, as if that unemployment buffoon had the right to disapprove of me. Brandon, my stepbrother, was too vested in the football match to spare me even a moment of attention. I hated my family. I could not wait a second longer to get away with it all. So, I called Mr. Pearson. The next day, he came by to pick me up in an old-fashioned yet gorgeous-looking automobile. I was slightly caught off guard when he stepped out to open the door for me. Will your family not be joining us? No, I haven't told them. Ah, perhaps it is for the better. I didn't quite understand what he meant by that, so I chalked it up to some sort of wealthy folks' polite expression and thought no more of it. During the ride to the residence, I learned that Mr. Pearson was in fact Mr. Moore's personal aide. He hadn't used the term butler, but I was under the expression that that's what he meant. For a moment, as the town behind us faded from view, I felt as though I was being chauffeured away in a pumpkin Cadillac in some weird Americana kind of fairy tale. But soon thereafter I began to think about the man who bestowed this new life upon me. Even on the rare occasion that we made conversation, Mr. Moore seldom revealed much about himself. On the contrary, he asked at length about me and my family and seemed to show a genuine interest in my life. He even once remarked that he wished he had a daughter or granddaughter like me. How ironic it was, I mused, that a girl who wanted nothing to do more with her family would cross paths with a man who yearned for a family yet did not possess one. Welcome to the Moore's Manor, Miss Bennet. Please make yourself comfortable. At first glance, it was magnificent. Who would have suspected that a modest old man who preferred his toast unbuttered had lived in such an extravagant home? In every room hang chandeliers. On every wall, majestic paintings, statues, big and small, littered throughout the halls of the 10-bedroom mansion. Yet in spite of it all, the place seemed to be shrouded in an air of gloom and despair. Mr. Pearson accompanied me on a tour of my soon-to-be home, enlightening me to the history of the manor, as well as the family who lived here for generations. He showed me the wine cellar, the library, and the stable where the horses were kept back in the day. At some point, I jokingly blurted out, "Do you also come with the house?" Upon seeing his unamused reaction, I quickly realized the extent of my insensitivity. Mr. Pearson was, as a matter of fact, of African descent. I apologized profusely, but the damage had already been done. The latter half of the tour unbearably quiet. When at last Mr. Pearson spoke to me again, I found myself in an elegantly furnished office which once belonged to the masters of the house. "Miss Bennet, there is something that Mr. Moore wished for you to see." He gestured for me to take a seat and presented to me a quaint little chest built of solid wood. Inside of it was an ample stack of envelopes, with one of the very top being addressed to Rebecca. Oh, letters. Nobody had ever written a physical letter to me before. At last, I thought to myself, I would get to know the man who thought of me as family. At last, I would get to know the enigmatic Mr. Moore. A word of caution, if I may. Mr. Pearson looked at me earnest. My employer, Mr. Moore, was a troubled man. What do you mean by that? I trust that these letters will explain. I'm not sure I follow. I will be right outside if you need me. I shall take my leave now. When Mr. Pearson closed the door behind him and I was left alone with the box, I sensed an abrupt change in the air. I imagined the voices that used to echo between these walls, faintly reverberating once again. It's probably a haunted house. Pamela's remark suddenly intruded my mind, sending a chill from the base of my neck to the tip of my fingers. Anxiously, I opened the unsealed envelope of the first letter. It read, "Darling Rebecca, should this letter make its way to you, I wish for you to know that I wholly intend to fulfill all of my promises to you, and that I love you with every fiber of my being. Our separation is but a temporary arrangement. You will always be the love of my life, and I yours. From the bottom of my aching heart, yours truly, Henry W. Moore." Upon further inspection, the faded ink and crumbling edge of the paper seemed to indicate that the letter was much older than I was. It then occurred to me that the letter was not intended for me. I read the letter from top to bottom again and again, and I still remained perplexed by its message. Eventually, I moved on to the next letter, hoping that it would shed light on the mysteries of the first. "Dearest Rebecca, forgive me, for I do not have any good news with which to adorn this letter. My stubborn father remains stubborn, and I a captive in these chambers. I hope that you are enduring my absence better than I am enduring yours. For these days, the mere thought of you gnaws at my heart. I can picture you now in that red and yellow sundress, your flowing black hair and ebony skin glistening under the moonlight, ever entrenched in your own thoughts, with that faraway look and those dark hazel eyes. What are you thinking of in these trying times? Who are you thinking of? As of late, the only thing on my mind is the solace of your tender embrace. With love, Henry W. Moore." As I gently folded the letter back into the envelope, I couldn't help but piece together in my mind a picture of the other Rebecca. My entire body shuddered as I realized I had envisioned her in my own image. For the next hour, I read a dozen more of these letters, each one more intimate and more desperate than the last. As I neared the bottom of the pile, I found a letter addressed not to Rebecca, but rather to Mr. Henry Moore. "To Mr. Henry Moore, I write to you to let you know that I am well. My mother and I will be leaving for Alabama in the morn. Your father, Mr. Edward Moore, had been so kind to us in the past, and I hope you will find it in you to forgive him and bear no ill thoughts towards him. There is something which I must tell you, and I pray that you do not receive these news harshly. It is not clear to me now that we are not meant to be, not in this life, perhaps in another time, perhaps under other circumstances. This past winter I met a man. His name is James. James looked after my mother and I ever since we were cast away from the manor. He is a man with a gentle soul, like you. The Lord has blessed us with a child, which I now carry in my womb. If the child be a boy, James agrees to name him Wilfred, after you. I now return to you this jewelry box which you had gifted me long ago, along with all the letters you had Sam bring me, for I no longer have a place by my side. I wish you a long and happy life, Mr. Moore. Know that I truly admire you for the man you are, and will forever hold you dear in my heart. Humbly, Rebecca Pearson. P.S. Please look after my nephew Sam. He is a foolish one. My hands quivered as a tear rolled down my cheek. As it felt, I noticed that it had not been the first time to stain the page. I found myself weeping, awash with a profound feeling of sorrow. Wilfred, I knew that name. James, I knew that name. Finally, at the bottom of the box was the final envelope. It was not like the others, in the lack of tattered edges and yellowish discoloration. It was addressed to Rebecca Bennet. I wasted no time in opening it. A photograph fell onto my lap as I unfolded the letter. I let out a gasp as soon as I recognized the person in the creased and faded picture. It was Rebecca, and she was a spitting image of myself. Only her complexion was several shades darker. Also in the photograph were two young boys, one whom shared the same skin tone as Rebecca. The other was Caucasian. I suspected them to be Mr. Pearson. The letter read, Dear Rebecca, I write to you from this bed in which I will in all likelihood breathe the last of my breaths. For too many years I have overstayed my welcome in this world. Truly, those Sunday mornings spent in your company were the only things which kept this weary soul going. Rebecca, my child, there is something that I must confess to you, and though I dare not ask for your forgiveness, I want you to know of the burden and shame I have carried with me all these years since that fateful evening seemingly a lifetime ago. If you have read the other letters in this box, you will know that I once very much loved a woman who shared your name. Like you, she was a beautiful woman with a beautiful soul. I, on the other hand, was a selfish and jealous boy. When I read her words of farewell, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I was utterly broken. For many months I wallowed in dejection, in grief, in contempt. It was during that time that within my heart a darkness grew, unfettered, consuming me whole. On the 3rd day of May, in the year 1950, I donned the white robes of the Ku Klux Klan for the very first time. In the months that followed, I did many despicable things, too numerous to count, too many to atone for in my lifetime. When my father discovered the breadth of my involvement with the Klan, I was banished from the house, and rightfully so. I became a drifter, with no one to call family, and no place to call home. Lonely and desperate, I blamed two of the people for all my miseries, Rebecca Pearson and a man named James. And so I found myself in Birmingham, Alabama. There, I joined the ranks of the local Klansmen, and there I learned the whereabouts of a man by the name of James Bennet and his wife, Rebecca Bennet. On the night of October 21st, 1950, my accomplices and I set fire to their home. My body trembled as I turned the letter over to the backside. I watched from afar as the house went up in a blazing inferno. I listened to the cries of the children as they were carried out of that little overcrowded house. For a brief moment I allowed myself to lighten their suffering, and in that moment the last of my humanity was nearly extinguished. It was then I heard a familiar voice. James! James! I heard the frantic, agonized scream of the woman who I loved so dearly. I watched in horror as I found her through the windows of the upper floor, a silhouette among the smoldering flames. Her cries grew louder, more painful. "Take Wilfred! Take Wilfred!" she screamed until the flames engulfed her entirely. Moments later, a man emerged from the blaze, his clothes burned to a crisp, his skin thoroughly charred. With the last bit of life within him, he placed the infant on the ground. With the grace of a loving father, coming to my senses at last, I discarded the wicked costume and raced towards the house. I picked the baby boy from the ground, whose body was wrapped in his mother's robes. When I saw his bright blue eyes and fair olive skin, my heart sank to the bottom of the ocean. There was no mistake. Wilfred was my very own son. The boy's family wrestled him from my grasp, and I was forced to flee into the nearby woods, where I spent a sleepless night, haunted by image of Rebecca's burning silhouette. The next morning I turned myself into the law. I spent the next 45 years in prison, contemplating my unspeakable folly. It was during that time I received a visit from Samuel, an old friend whose aunt I had murdered in cold blood. He came to me, bearing the news of my father's death, and that of my mother, and that of my brothers and nieces and nephews. It was as though a curse had fallen upon the household. The Moore's estate had somehow, despite the circumstances, found its way back to me. Some years later, I was granted permission to serve the remainder of my sentence under house arrest and allowed to leave the premises once a week. At that time, Samuel revealed to me that his cousin Wilfred had given his life in the line of duty as a firefighter, leaving behind an infant and a daughter who he named after his own mother. When I saw you for the first time, I knew it had to be true. You were every bit as beautiful as your grandmother. I wished you a long, happy life, Rebecca, my child. And though your love and affection will forever elude me, I know that I loved you ever since the very first time I laid my eyes on you. Humbly, Henry Wilfred Moore.